Today we begin with the tide turns. The Japanese are going to begin to resort to kamikaze attacks in order to hopefully defend themselves and to change the Americans' mind about invading. A kamikaze is the Japanese word for a divine wind, and if you remember back to world history, we talked about how the Japanese had been saved from the Mongol invasion by typhoons that came up and destroyed the Mongol navy. And they called it a kamikaze, a spirit wind that saved them. Well, they will apply this term to the pilots of their Air Force in World War II, because these pilots were given the order to deliberately crash their planes into American ships or American bases. And they are very successful at this. At the Philippines, they sink 16 ships and damage 80 others. In total, roughly 400 American ships will be sunk and 10,000 American lives will be lost due to these attacks. Now, this is a change in their method of war, because this is not only physical warfare, but it's also psychological warfare, because they're messing with American minds, because we don't understand why suicide would be preferable to just an on attack. So we don't understand that. But if you remember from world history, we talked about in Japan how suicide is not looked down upon by the Japanese. It comes from the samurai tradition. And the samurai tradition had a ritual called harakiri, where the shamed individual, someone who was shamed, who had been part of something that was shameful, could take their lives, their own lives, in order to make amends for any failure that they had done. So they would disembowel themselves with a knife. They would fall upon their sword. And so harakiri is seen as sort of a different form of kamikaze attacks, that this was a way for them to redeem themselves, a way to honor themselves and their families. So the tide begins to turn because of this large amount of very bloody battles that will take place in the Pacific. The first is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a month-long battle for just an 8 square mile piece of volcanic island. There's really not much that's going on there, with the exception that for the Japanese it's very important because it's their last line of radar defense. For the Americans, it's important because this could be a base for us, for our very heavily loaded planes to take off and actually reach Japan with heavier weapons. So it is very heavily defended by the Japanese. Roughly 20,000, a little more than 20,000 are going to be stationed there. And 6 million, oh my goodness, that's a large number. 6,000 Marines are going to be lost in capturing this island, the greatest number in a battle of the Pacific. By the time we are done, however, only 200 Japanese are left on the island by the end of the battle. So we pretty much take them out. It's from this battle that we get the famous image of the 6 Marines raising the American flag. 3 of those Marines will die on Iwo Jima. The next major battle will take place in Okinawa. Okinawa was a part of the Japanese home island chain, so it's going to be the first time that we actually begin attacking Japan on its own territory. The attack begins Easter Sunday, which also landed on April 1st, or April Fool's Day, and it's sort of an indicator as to how this battle goes. The Japanese will allow the Americans to land on their island, and then they destroy their naval support. So there's nowhere for them to go but to fight. It ends up being the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Eventually, the Americans will suffer 80,000 casualties and the Japanese 160,000, but we do win the battle. In the middle of this, we have a change in leadership in the United States. On April 12, 1945, FDR dies while in office. His vice president, Harry Truman, is going to be the one who takes over. And Truman has a major decision to make. The Battle of Okinawa gave Americans a taste of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might be like. Churchill will estimate that it might take as many as 1 million American lives and about 50 or 500,000 British lives in order to finally defeat the Japanese. On April 24th, just 12 days after FDR passes away, Truman is informed about the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was a project that was dealing with the development of a new weapon called the atomic bomb. Now, Truman initially is very reluctant to use this, given the fact that he knows very little about it. He had not known anything about it prior to April 24th, and he is going to order a search for alternatives to see if there is another way that we can get Japan to capitulate.